Okay, I'm really excited about this podcast because it's a little bit of a different take today. I'm talking with Dr. Mario Garcia, who is a legend, an icon, Chicano studies historian. He's just a historian. He knows so much about so many topics. And we're going to talk about journalist Ruben Salazar, who's really an icon, pioneer in journalism circles. He was somebody who was writing about what was going on in the Mexican American Latino community long before anyone else was. And he worked for Los Angeles Times. He also worked for KMEX. And he's really somebody who had a very distinguished career. Not a lot of people know about him outside of journalism, but he's had a major impact in terms of the types of stories that he has covered. He died in controversial fashion at the hands of the LA Sheriff's Department. And we talk a little bit about the day that he died while he was covering the Chicano moratorium, which was a protest of the number of Mexican Americans and Chicanos who were dying in the Vietnam War. So this is a really cool conversation with Dr. Garcia. He takes some time to sort of break it all down. And we also talk about some contemporary issues as well. We talk about what's going on, currently in the state of the country in 2021. So we get all kinds of great views on racial justice, social justice, a lot of history, and this is a really cool podcast. Thank you for taking the time to appreciate and watch this podcast. I'm really hoping that you take a minute to like and subscribe. Check it out, get familiar with the channel, because this is my own deal. It's my own endeavor. It's something that I'm trying to do that's no one else is really doing. It's a little bit different. So I interview a whole bunch of people from all kinds of walks of life. It's very diverse. So I'm glad that you take the time to watch and listen. These podcasts are also available on all podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, everywhere you get your podcasts. So thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Take care. Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's my pleasure today to be here with Dr. Mario Garcia, one of the founders of the Chicano Studies Department at UCSB, and a real icon and legend, and super knowledgeable of Chicano studies and a variety of issues facing Chicanos and the Latinx community. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today, Mario. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you so much, Josh, for inviting me to your program. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I obviously, I've known of you for a long time, and I interviewed you a couple times at the very beginning of my career about 25 years ago. So I've been aware of you and, knowledgeable of your works, but I wanted to talk to you about a few things today. I wanted to lead off with some discussion about journalist Ruben Salazar, who is an icon in journalism circles, particularly among Latino journalists and people who are appreciating the sort of history of Latino journalists. And his birthday was in March. Obviously, he was shot and, he was killed under mysterious circumstances at the Silver Dollar Club while he was working, while he was covering a Chicano moratorium march on related to the Vietnam War. And so I wanted to sort of talk, I wanted to ask you, because you're featured in so many of these projects and these videos about his career. And I don't know that a lot of people really understand sort of the role and the impact he had, both in terms of his work as well as sort of inspiring future journalists. Can you talk a little bit about Mr. Salazar and why he was so impactful as a journalist?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I mean, I, like so many others, at some point became fascinated with Ruben Salazar. And again, it amazes me how every generation seems to rediscover Ruben Salazar and become interested and fascinated with his story. I mean, I first was aware of Ruben Salazar as a journalist himself with the Los Angeles Times.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't in LA at the time when he was writing in the 1960s. So I just knew that he had written for the LA Times. And of course, those of us who come out of the Chicano movement were aware that he was that journalist who happened to have been killed on August 29th, 1970. in East Los Angeles, which was characterized by the largest demonstration during the period of the Chicano movement of the late 60s and into the 70s. And this was the demonstration against the war in Vietnam. And it's estimated that, well, the number usually mentioned is 20,000. It could have been more people, mostly Chicanos, who protested against the war in Vietnam on that hot, sunny, smoggy day in East Los Angeles. And they were protesting a war that they felt was unjust, was a war that was injuring the Chicano people. Number one, because a lot of Chicanos were being drafted into the war. And a study that was done by Professor Ralph Guzman at Cal State LA in the late 60s showed the disproportionate number of Chicanos who were being drafted. So that, for example, he pointed out, while Chicanos represented 10% of the 5 southwestern states, which at that time was where the majority of Chicanos lived, they represented 10% of that population, yet they represented 20% of the casualties from the southwestern states. So this was a disproportionate drafting of Chicanos into the military, and many of them being into the war in Vietnam, many of them not coming back. We don't know the number of Chicanos that were killed. We know about 60,000 Americans' lives were lost in the war in Vietnam. And the figures seen, although they're not official, that it may be between 5,000 to 6,000 Chicanos were killed, or Latinos as well, killed in the war in Vietnam. And of course, that doesn't speak to the number who came back injured, physically and emotionally. So the Chicano movement took on the war in Vietnam as an issue that was central to the Chicano movement. They also pointed out that to pay for the war, the government, the administration, with Johnson administration and then the Nixon administration, they were siphoning off funds from anti-poverty programs, educational programs, from welfare programs to fund the war in Vietnam.
Wow. President
Johnson had said that we could have what he called guns and butter, meaning we could have the war in Vietnam and we could still have this great society and anti-poverty programs. In the end, he couldn't have both. He unfortunately chose the war over the anti-poverty program. So Chicanos were demonstrating the war because it had become a Chicano issue. Ruben Salazar was covering that demonstration. His position in 1970 was twofold. He had written for the Los Angeles Times from the early 60s all the way through 1969 as a reporter. But in the early part of 1970, he decided to accept an offer from KBX, Channel 34, at that time the only Spanish language television station in LA, to become the news director. He, in a way, didn't want to leave the LA Times, although he had felt that he had never been fully appreciated by the LA Times. Mm-hmm. And so he and the Times worked out an arrangement where he would write a column, a weekly column for the LA Times. He would no longer be on the staff, but he would write a weekly column. And those columns allowed Ruben the opportunity to really get into his own struggle with his identity as a Chicano, as a Mexican American, and the wonderful columns. But his main job was at KMEX, and at KMEX he was exposing a lot of police abuse in the barrios of East LA, for example. There was no love lost between the police, which would be the LAPD and the county sheriffs, and Ruben Salazar. And I say that deliberately because after his death, he was killed after the protest. He and his TV crew had retired back down on Whittier Boulevard, which had been the main route of the march. And they went into the Silver Dollar Cafe, a bar, to, I guess, get a beer and just kind of get away from all the tear gas that was all over the place. Shortly thereafter, a squad car of the county sheriff showed up and without warning shot one, maybe two tear gas projectiles into the bar. The autopsy later showed that one of the tear gas projectiles had struck Ruben in the head and instantly killed him. And his body was later found and identified as Ruben Salazar. So he became an instant martyr for the Chicano movement. And that's why, he's still recognized and celebrated. And we can talk further about that because, in my own opinion, Ruben Salazar would have been the last person that would want to be seen as a martyr for the Chicano movement. I mean, he, in the end, comes to support the Chicano movement, but as a journalist, and even with KMEX, he felt that there was a professional line that he could not cross. He could not be a professional a journalist / activist at the same time. Yeah. He felt that he always had to remain somewhat distant, even though he was supportive of the movement, but still retain his professional credentials. So in a way, he's one of those situations where you're at the wrong place at the wrong time. But he is killed. He's one of 3 people that are killed in relationship to the demonstration. And so he receives almost, instant attention. People began to recognize who he was and so forth. And in my opinion, that's important because there's no question that at the time of his death, he was the most noted Latino journalist in the country. There's no question about it. There were almost no Latino journalists, as far as I know, who were writing for mainstream major newspapers at that time, like the Los Angeles Times. So that Ruben was a pioneer. Yeah. He was a pioneer, and he had been working on it for several, with the Times for a number of years. So anyway, so I was aware of learning about Ruben as a journalist. That got interested in me. And then much later on, as I began to realize that we were coming up in 1995 on the 25th anniversary of his death, I had decided a few years earlier that it would be important to do a book, an edited volume of Ruben Salazar's, the best of his journalism. Mm-hmm. And so that I was able to obtain the copies of his different reporting pieces from the Times and also the columns that he later wrote. And I selected what I thought were the best and published in an edited volume that came out in 1995. And I'll hold the book up and see if you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you see it, Joshua?
Yeah. I have that book. Yeah.
Okay. So it's entitled Ruben Salazar, Border Correspondent, Selected Writings, 1955-1970, which I edited, published by the University of California Press. This image of Ruben Salazar was done by the very prominent artist Rupert Garcia, no relationship to me, who did this image of Ruben Salazar for an art exhibit in San Francisco a few months after Ruben was killed. And, I was aware of the image. When I was doing the book, I said, this is the image, it's got to be the cover for the book. It's a wonderful image. So, and this is the first real book or attempt to try to somehow bring together Ruben Salazar's, especially his journalism career. Very little had been published on Ruben Salazar in the 25 years after his death. So my book was the first one to really try to, begin to bring some kind of more attention to who he was and his work. And so that's the reason I did the book, and that's how I came across Ruben Salazar. And but I mentioned in the book that first and foremost he needs to be recognized again as the major journalist that he was, and how the professional that he was, and his great reporting. He he had been a reporter for a few years prior to being in the LA Times. And in my research for this book, I also discovered that Ruben Salazar, like me, came from the El Paso area. I was born in El Paso along the border. Ruben was actually born in Ciudad Juarez, the city across from El Paso in the 1930s. But when he was still a baby, the family crossed the border and settled in El Paso. And Ruben later becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen. But his whole life is really in El Paso and along the border. And after high school and after he was in the military, he came back and got his journalism degree at what was then called the Texas Western College, which is now referred to as University of Texas El Paso, or UTEP, which is also my alma mater. And after he got his degree, he then was hired at one of the local El Paso newspapers, the El Paso Herald-Post, which is Scripps Howard newspaper, and was a more liberal paper of the two newspapers in El Paso, the other being the El Paso Times, a more conservative paper. So Ruben started his career as a journalist with the El Paso Herald. And he did some basic reporting, but he did some incredible reporting as well, which I discovered, and I include some of those stories in this book, in which he did some investigative reporting. And for example, the conditions at the city jail were awful, were notorious situation. So Ruben, to investigate the conditions in the local city jail, disguised himself as but he was a drunk. He was a drunk. So he's arrested and put in the jail. And so he does his investigative reporting within the jail, disguised as someone who was inebriated.
Yeah, right.
And then he writes about his experience in the awful conditions as kind of an insider story.
Mm-hmm.
So this becomes major news. It's front page news in the El Paso Herald-Post. We're talking here in the mid-1950s. And he also did investigative reporting about the drug conditions along the border and the drug trade in South El Paso, which was in Mexican Barrio, and how you had some notorious kind of drug rings that were operating there. So he did investigative reporting there by disguising himself as someone who wanted to purchase some of these drugs. Mm-hmm. And so he gets in there and that's part of this investigation. So he had developed quite a good reputation as an investigative journalist at the El Paso Herald-Post. But I think Ruben always felt that he wanted to go beyond his local community and try to achieve perhaps more prominence in other journalistic opportunities. So he came to California, following as so many other Mexican Americans eventually come, including myself, eventually came to California. And he first got some journalistic positions in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 50s. And then around 59 or so, he comes down to Los Angeles and gets hired in one of the more minor Los Angeles newspapers. And then, but he writes enough so he becomes known to the powers that be at the LA Times, who around 1961, the new editor of the Times is Otis Chandler Jr. The Chandler family had owned the Times since the late 19th century, but it's like a new generation now taking over. And Otis Chandler Jr. wants to transfer the LA Times from a well-known paper, but it was not a respectful paper. It was among newspapers in the country, the LA Times was looked down upon as a mediocre newspaper. Chandler wanted to make it into a world-class newspaper, both in terms of national coverage and international coverage, and even local coverage. And he knew in terms of local coverage and regional coverage, he already knew enough about the growing importance of the Mexican American population that he needed someone to cover it. that's where Ruben comes in. They hire Ruben initially to cover the Mexican-American community and also the region of the Southwest of the U.S.-Mexico border. And he writes some very, very wonderful stories, including a 5-part award-winning series on East Los Angeles. And so he becomes, well known in the LA Times. And his work is so good that in 1965, he now is transferred to become a foreign correspondent. They send him to cover the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in 65, and he does a good job there, good enough that they then will send him to Vietnam to be one of, I think, 2 or 3 LA Times correspondents in Vietnam as the war escalates in the mid-1960s. And he does a year or so of coverage there, and then and does a good enough job that he's asked to come back, and he's promoted to become the bureau chief in Mexico City, the LA Times bureau chief in Mexico City, covering Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And he loved that. He loved that. That was probably the best experience that he had, to be in the bureau chief, because he was his own boss. And he selected his own stories and so forth. And his family lived there in Mexico City. They had a chauffeur. They had, they had a nice place to live in and so forth. However, in 1968, in March of 1968, you have in Los Angeles the East LA blowouts or walkouts in the East LA public schools. In the first week of March of 1968, thousands of young Chicano students walk out of their schools and protest against years and years of segregated and inferior education. And this protest, called the blowouts, shook LA in a way that, because they didn't recognize the grievances that the Mexican-American population had. They saw race in black and white. They didn't have any sense of the racism that was affecting Mexican Americans historically, and even in the 1960s, where they were still, they were basically seen as pools of cheap labor, as they had always been seen as pools of cheap labor, either as U.S. born, but also the immigrants who had been coming in the course of the 20th century. The early 20th century, immigrant workers from Mexico were literally hired in what were called Mexican jobs, and they were paid Mexican wages. And the kids had to go to segregated so-called Mexican schools that were inferior schools. And so those Mexican schools were still alive and well in LA in 1968. And so the LA Times is also taken aback. They had not recognized, even though they had hired Ruben to cover the Mexican American community, they knew some of the issues. But the shock of the walkouts really, really amazed them. And also, they realized they had no reporter to cover the Mexican American community after Ruben had left and gone on as a foreign correspondent. And so Otis Chancellor does, at least the way to the story, that Otis Chancellor Jr. personally contacted Ruben Salazar in Mexico City and said, "We need you back. We need you back, because there's this developing story in the Mexican American Chicano community. I mean, there is a movement there, and we need to have it covered." Ruben didn't really want to come back. He liked being the bureau chief in Mexico City, but he was always a good company man, Josh, and so he agreed to come. And he started covering the Chicano movement. So he wrote stories about the Chicano movement and so forth. And then that brings us up to when he goes to KMEX, and then of course he's covering the Chicano movement and the protests against the war, and unfortunately is killed. Now, some people, as I mentioned earlier, because of some of the reporting that he was doing in investigating police abuse in East LA, some people after his death came up with conspiracy theories that maybe the county sheriffs were deliberately after Ruben Salazar that day and were trailing him. And therefore they knew that he was in that cafe, that bar, and set out to kill him. Now, that's never been proven. No smoking gun has ever been uncovered, but there's still conspiracy theories there. I mean, those conspiracy theories continue because there was no thorough investigation that was done about why was Ruben Salazar killed? What happened? Why were the sheriffs there? And so forth and so on. There was no this is pre-Rodney King, and even the LA Times wasn't going to take on the LAPD or the county sheriff. You just didn't do that.
Yeah.
And so there was no real full investigation. So, but for me, the most important thing about Ruben Salazar was that he was a damn good journalist, professional journalist, and a real pioneer. No one else was writing for a mainstream newspaper like the LA Times other than Ruben Salazar. Mm-hmm. And he opened up the opportunity for other Mexican American, Latino journalists to follow in his place. And so later, other reporters are hired, like Frank Palomo, and others who are hired. And that happens, of course, among other newspapers, and then eventually on television and radio. And so in the last 50 years, we've seen, and you would know better, a multiplication of the number of Latino journalists at all levels that we have. But in the 1960s, there was only one, and that was Ruben Salazar. Yeah. And so we really indebted to him as a pioneer in Latino journalism. And so that's kind of my approach to Ruben.
Now, you mentioned that back then, race was sort of looked at as black and white, and largely Mexican Americans were considered part of the sort of the working pool. You know, they were labor groups. How much has that changed in your perspective? Obviously, in 2020, we saw Black Lives Matter rise to the national mainstream because of the George Floyd killing, and we saw lots of attention. Black Lives Matter was known before that. Do you still see growth areas for an awareness of racism beyond just black and white, and also looking at whether it's Asian Americans and Mexican Americans? How much have we improved since those days?
Well, let me say, first of all, racism in America has never been just black and white. Yeah. Obviously, the racism toward people of African American descent has been horrendous, beginning with slavery and Jim Crow, and the continuation of racism as we see it even today. And as you said, exemplified by this past summer, the Black Lives Matter movement. But racism has also been endemic in many other communities of color, including among Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, and of course, Asian Americans, Native Americans, of course, beginning with the genocide against Native Americans. So racism has touched all peoples of color. It's been unfortunate that in the writing of American history, the focus has been too much heavily on the black-white relationship. And it's only been over the last several decades that historians like myself and others have brought attention to the fact that Mexican Americans, Chicanos, have also been affected, historically speaking, with racism, not just as an attitude, but we used to, in the 60s, we used to discuss institutionalized racism. That was the term. Now we're talking about systemic racism, but they're the same thing.
Yeah.
How racism is not just an attitude. Racism is implanted literally in the system and in the institutions to maintain the oppression of people of color. Why? Well, because they basically, it's either because we wanted lands from them, like the Native Americans, or in most of the cases, we wanted their labor, and mostly their cheap labor. And so that's how you build it into the system. That's why when I referred to earlier, when Mexican immigrants began to come across the border by the thousands in the early 20th century, and they were drawn in by the expansion of the railroads, the development of mining like in Arizona, agribusiness throughout the Southwest, and especially in California. Who was going to do the labor for that? And they were not, they had tried Asian Americans like the Chinese, but then in California, you had white people saying, well, no, I mean, these people are so different, they're going to just completely affect our culture and our race. And so the yellow peril syndrome developed. So that didn't happen. A lot of European immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were coming in the early 20th century, but there were so many industrial jobs in the East that many of them, didn't migrate to the Southwest in California. So where were these immigrants going to find the cheap labor they wanted? Well, they eventually turned to Mexico, which probably should have been the first place that they should have turned to. And so they helped to encourage thousands of Mexican immigrants to come across the border, and they were institutionalized into what were literally called Mexican jobs, which were the dirtiest, cheapest labor, not so much constructing railroads, but maintaining the railroads, working in the mines of southern Arizona, working in the fields from Texas to California. These were the Mexican jobs. And then they were complemented by what were literally called Mexican wages, the lowest wages paid throughout the Southwest and so forth. Forced to live in Mexican barrios where they had no paved streets, they had no sanitation, they had to build their own homes if they were living in the cities or their tents and out in the countryside. And then, as I tell my students, to add insult to injury, their children, many of them now US born, had to go to these infamous, meaning bad, Mexican schools that limited education, heavy focus on teaching the kids to learn with their hands, because after all, that's what they were going to be doing in the future. The girls were taught how to cook and sew, and the boys were taught how to work with tools. And yes, they taught them English in part in order so that they would be able to follow rules and follow the boss's orders, and enough American history to socialize them and to make them feel grateful for what little they had. But this was not really education that was meant to provide these kids with a level of mobility that would take them out of coming from poor working class families. The worst thing in these Mexican schools, as I also tell my students, is that too many teachers in these schools had low expectations of the students. So they would walk into a classroom and they look at all these Mexican kids. They did not believe that these kids could be taught at a very high level, because it was believed that the Mexicans were not only racially inferior physically, they were racially inferior mentally. And so you could only teach them up to a certain level. And that was the lowest common denominator. So there was a low expectation by the teachers. So systemic institutionalized racism has affected people of Mexican and Latino descent for decades. But in terms of the reaction to that, what's important to note, as I've attempted to do it in a lot of my work, is to show that Mexican Americans, to take that group as an example, have never just simply accepted institutionalized racism or systemic racism. They have fought against it. And so you've had a long history of Mexican American civil rights struggles. In some of my book, I've traced this back to the 1930s, when you began to have organizations like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the oldest Mexican American civil rights organization, where after World War II, a lot of the veterans came back, and you can believe it, they went to fight for democracy and against the racism of Germany and Japan. And they come back to their communities and they're faced with their racism against them and the continuation of systemic racism. And so they began to fight back. And you have a group like the American GI Forum that's organized, takes on a lot of these segregation in schools, segregation in jobs, discrimination in wages and housing, in public facilities like theaters, swimming pools, parks. All of these things had excluded Mexican Americans. I tell my students, for example, you had segregation like in beaches here in California, in Carpinteria, which is obviously close to us here in Santa Barbara. That main beach in Carpinteria up until the 1950s was segregated. Mexican Americans were not allowed to go to that main beach. They had to go further south, north, but not that, at the end of Linden Avenue, that main beach there, that was only for white people.
Wow.
So there's been a long history of Mexican Americans and other Latino groups fighting for civil rights. And I think we've now written enough of that history that I also maintain that we can no longer talk about civil rights, again, also just as a black-white issue. The discussion of American civil rights history now has to include other groups like Mexican Americans, Chicanos, who had a long history of civil rights activities. And the Chicano movement was very much a part of that. The Chicano movement that Ruben Salazar was covering was the largest and most expansive civil rights and empowerment movement by people of Mexican descent in the United States. I mean, it opened up tremendous opportunities that people didn't have before. Now, there's still a lot of systematic racism that affect Latinos and Mexican Americans. But what the Chicano movement showed that only by fighting back and struggling you begin to push back against that system, force it to open up. And one of the great successes of the Chicano movement that Ruben covered was the opportunity for kids to go to college. Very few had been attending college. Ruben was singular in the sense that he did go to college in the 1950s, but many, many others did not. And we look now, and we see now thousands, if not millions, of Latino kids and Mexican American students who are attending colleges and universities. And as you know, here at UCSB, we now are a so-called Hispanic service institution, which means that over 26% of our undergraduates, and it's much higher than that now, probably closer to 30, of our undergraduates are Latino students. And that's happening all over the country. That's probably one of the greatest achievements of the Chicano movement, which is what I tell my students, there's no free lunch. The elite, the people who control the system, they don't all of a sudden decide, well, maybe Chicanos should begin to go to higher education here in the 1960s and 70s. No, that was a result of the Chicano movement pushing, struggling, protesting, picketing, and so forth, taking over buildings and so forth. That forced the system to change. And that's the only way that the system will even change now. And I think Ruben Salazar was coming to be aware of that. That's why in his columns, you can see that he was sympathetic to what the movement was doing. He knew that he could not be an activist because of his professional position, but he certainly supported it. And I think, Josh, a lot more attention has to be paid how racism has also affected other groups like Latinos, but also how Latinos, Chicanos have fought back against that. We have had our own Black Lives Matter moments, a lot of those moments.
Yeah.
And it's just that they haven't been as much. And this is, getting to the discussion of the media, so that the media doesn't pay as much attention to the racism against groups like Latinos, which is unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Or it doesn't pay enough attention to the movements and the protests by Latinos and Chicanos and Mexican Americans against that kind of racialized system. The killing of Black people that we saw since the summer, George Floyd and others, I mean, it's horrific. But on any given day, in places like LA, the cops shoot Chicano kids, and they shoot other Latinos, and it never rises to the George Floyd level. So I think the media has to do a lot better job. And I say this, even having said earlier that we have more Latinos in the media. But it's not enough to have Latinos in the media. They have to be what Sal Castro, whose story I wrote also, and who was the key teacher who motivated the students in the walkouts in '68. And one of the demands of the students was that they wanted more Mexican American teachers and Mexican American administrators. And looking at the long legacy of the blowouts and the walkouts, what do we see? We see a lot of Latino teachers and administrators today, some even on school boards. But not all of them are what Sal Castro called change makers. Change makers. He said, we need change makers. People are going to go in and not just accept the status quo in order to get promoted and so forth, but that are going to shake up the system. And so to make changes. And so we need perhaps more of our own Latino representatives in the media to shake things up and say, hey, we've got to cover, that killing of that Chicano kid in East, because this is by the cops. This is a major story, or covering protest or the organization of Latinos to fight back against racism, give that more coverage. So we also have a lot of work to do, and hopefully that will happen.
Yeah, being a journalist, even with all the strides that we've made, it's always rare to have more than in the newsrooms I've worked at in San Diego and Santa Barbara and San Jose, and other places. It's, you have a few, Mexican American journalists, Latinos, it's rarer to have African American journalists and Asian journalists. So even with our strides, there's still a gap between those in power and those who are on the ground doing the reporting. And, covering, you talk about Mexican American change makers. I'd say in my 25 years, too often they say they're going to make change in a campaign, and then they get elected and they become just like everyone else before them. And so that's the thing with politics,
Well, I was going to say that I would apply the same criticism that I just made, that would apply to Latino politicians. Yeah. Although some are very good, like our own Salud Carvajal here, our congressman in Washington is very good. Salud, in fact, Salud was one of my students in one of my Chicano studies classes. So I claim him as one of my and Salud knows where his heart needs to be, and he's always struggling to make sure that things are improved for the entire community, but especially also for the Latino community, which has had less representation. And but I wanted to, if I may, just plug my most recent book, because it fits into the discussion. This is a book that just came out. It's a co-edited volume called Rewriting the Chicano Movement. Yeah. And here is a number of essays that deals with the Chicano movement of the 60s and 70s and the struggles by Chicanos, Mexican Americans against, again, systemic racism in education, in politics, in the media, in art. And so it's a wide-ranging number of essays are wide-ranging in terms of the issues and so forth. And by rewriting the Chicano movement, we simply mean not that the Chicano movement, we're suggesting the Chicano movement was anything less. All of these essays and the book itself, first and foremost, note that the Chicano movement was a seminal, a major moment in the history of Mexicans in the United States. As I said earlier, it was the largest movement, social movement of Mexican Americans in terms of dealing with systemic racism. And through its so-called direct action, in the streets and so forth, it forced the system to respond. And that's why we began to have more kids in schools, began to have more political representation, more representation in the media and the arts, in business and so forth and so on. The book begins with that understanding of the importance of the movement, but rewriting simply means that 50 years more or less after some of the key periods of the movement, we are expanding our understanding of the movement. You know, for example, looking at more the role that women played in the movement, more the geographic diversity of the movement. So yeah, LA was a central point, Texas was a central point, but the movement was everywhere. It was up in the Pacific Northwest, it was in the Midwest. It was not just in the bigger cities like LA, it was in Fresno, it was in the Valley, in the Central Valley, it was in the lower Valley of Texas. And so by rewriting, we mean that historians today, especially younger historians who are rediscovering the movement, are bringing a lot of new themes, new subjects. So we are expanding our understanding of the Chicano movement. That's what we mean by rewriting. But I note in the book, and I've been asked in other interviews, what do you hope that people will take from that book? And I said, well, I want them to know about the book. I want them to read about the book. Then I want them to reflect, especially if they're of Chicano Latino background, but of any background, of say, okay, well, what am I now going to do to carry on the legacy of the movement? And what was that legacy? That legacy was of struggling against racism, discrimination, inequality, struggling for a greater democratization of this country and so forth. And so all of us need to say, okay, how can we continue this struggle? And especially after just having come through the nightmare of these last 4 years of Trump, where there were a lot of setbacks to civil rights, to our democratic institutions. How are we now going to carry out a legacy like the Chicano movement or the Black Lives Matter movement or the earlier Black Civil Rights? How are we going to carry on that legacy to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and how we continue to struggle for a complete and full democratization of this country so that people have all their equal and basic rights, and that we make major advances to leveling the system so that we don't have these gross inequalities in incomes that we face today. And that gross inequality, we know, is also related to issues of race. And so that's the legacy that I think the Chicano movement gives to us. But it's only good if people say, yeah, well, now I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to pick up the mantle now and carry it forward now.
Yeah, you know, very well put. What do you think of this humanitarian crisis that we're seeing with what's happening with all these kids coming in, you know, kids alone without their parents at the border? We're reading these national reports that are saying that, you know, it's increasing. It's so many, it's more. And the Biden is saying, stop coming. These things happen, and they were happening with Obama, they were happening with Trump, they're happening still right under our noses while we talk about these other things that are in the media. But yeah, we have this legitimate issue here at our border. What is your take on that? And is that an issue that can ever be resolved?
No, I wouldn't say it will never be resolved, but I mean, it's a tragic issue. And the tragedy begins in Central America, which is where these kids are mostly coming from. They're not coming from Mexico, they're coming from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, because there are still so much poverty, so much inequality, so much repression by their governments, so much corruption by those governments. And in addition to that, you have gang violence in these countries. Some of these gangs, like MS-13 in El Salvador, for example, have their origins in that earlier migration in the 1960s of Central Americans who came to the US, like to LA in particular, fleeing civil wars and repression in those countries. And as they settled, eventually some of the kids were affected by the gangs, like in East LA, and they developed their own gangs. And at some point, a lot of these people are deported, and then they reinstitute the gangs in El Salvador. So it's a very bad situation for people. And one doesn't necessarily blame them for wanting to migrate to here to get away from all of this violence.
Yeah.
But that's where the origins is. But I'll remind people that the U.S. is not innocent in that situation in Central America. It's also a U.S.-made situation or conditions. I mean, for years and years and years, you go back to the 1920s, you can talk about U.S. imperialism and how this U.S. imperialism was featured by American corporations, protected by the U.S. government, protected by the U.S. military, the Marines, to ensure that corporations who invested in Central America, especially in agricultural productions, hence the term Banana Republic, that those investments were protected. And they were protected not only by occasional U.S. military intervention, but also by ensuring that the governments of these Central American countries would in turn also protect these American corporate resources. And what did that mean? That meant dictatorships, it meant military dictatorships, it meant strongmen to make sure that they protected the investments. And part of those investments, of course, was the exploitation of the Central American populations in terms of their cheap labor in the agricultural plantations and so forth. So the tragedy that we're still seeing in Central America is still in part stamped made in America. And what we saw in the 1980s, which I've recently written about in my biography of Father Luis Olivares, who was the key leader of the sanctuary movement in Los Angeles when we had thousands of refugees coming, even more so than we're seeing right now. Refugees come, eventually close to 1 million Salvadorans settled in the US, 500,000 in Los Angeles alone. They were fleeing the civil wars. And unfortunately, when they tried to enter the country, they faced the same kind of situation that the more recent refugees faced with the Trump administration. Then in the 1980s, you had the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration said, oh, no, these people are not legitimate refugees. They're coming just as illegal aliens to take jobs from real Americans, whatever that meant. In fact, they were legitimate political refugees. The only reason the Reagan administration did not want to label them political refugees because then it would undermine their political clients, which were the governments of Central America, like in El Salvador. And so, fortunately, a lot of good Americans stood up and said, no, these people are legitimate refugees and they need to be protected. And this is where you had a lot of religious and faith-based movements involved to provide literally sanctuary, to buy housing, feeding a lot of these refugees who came, trying to get them legal assistance so that they could argue for refugee status. And in Los Angeles, the key figure was Father Luis Olivares, a Catholic priest out of his parish, La Placita Church in downtown LA, Lady Queen of Angels. And he, any sanctuary movement in the country, his was the most impressive. I mean, they housed people. They literally housed male refugees in the church itself, in the church basement, or they found them other alternative housing. They tried to find them jobs. They fed them, they clothed them, they got their kids into schools, they got them legal assistance. His operation at La Placita Church was just totally impressive. So there's no question about his importance in the sanctuary movement, not only in LA, but throughout the country. So I've written his story, his biography, but it's connected because the conditions of forcing refugees from Central America has continued, so that we're seeing it continue today. Yes, there may not be civil wars per se, the kind that we saw in the 1980s, but there's versions of civil wars because you have the gang warfare, you have the military and governmental repression of the gangs. So you have a version of a civil war in places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And all of that just adds to more and more violence. The reason they came in the 80s was to flee from the violence in their countries. And today they're fleeing the violence again. If these kids stay, they're going to be forced to be members of these violent gangs.
There's so many people in the community, though, who have benefited from your teachings and your books and your writings. So I want to.
Well, I very much appreciate that, Josh. I'm entering now my 46th year at UCSD, and so I've seen a lot of students. I've seen a lot of changes in the community, but Santa Barbara has always been a good community for me and my family. UCSB has been a great university for me as well, to do my work, to do my research, to help in the development of Chicano studies. My whole goal in being in Chicano studies for all of these years has been to make it as an institution that will broaden our understanding of the role of people of Mexican and Latino descent in the United States, not just in terms of some of the issues that we talked about, like issues like racism, but the things that Chicanos and Latinos have contributed to this country, in addition to their labor, but also the cultural contributions. And now that we have scholars of Chicano, Mexican American background, Latino background like myself, the tremendous scholarly contributions that we're making. The scholarship in Chicano Latino studies has grown by leaps and bounds over the last 50 years. And therefore, there is no question why that kind of knowledge should not be also utilized in other departments on campus. But I'll finish with one last thing, if I may, Josh.
Yes.
We've made these major scholarly gains in terms of the production of knowledge about Chicanos and Latinos. And I see it at the university level, but my greatest disappointment is that a lot of this knowledge that I and others have helped create has not effectively steeped down in the K to 12. In the K to 12. That is one of the greatest challenges we face in California and even here in Santa Barbara going forward. Why is it that with all this knowledge about Chicanos and Latinos, that it's not seeped down to the K to 12? In a situation here in California, most of those students from K to 12 are Chicanos and Latinos, and are being deprived of this production of this new knowledge, so that they don't know, they have no idea of how Chicanos and Latinos have made American history, have been American history. So that if they don't know that, they will feel just like those kids in '68 when they went out, they were protesting the lack of that kind of knowledge. They were made to feel, as Sal Castro said, they were made to feel like strangers in their own classrooms. There was nothing in their classrooms that spoke to them of their particular background and of their contributions to American history. And unfortunately, I think we're still facing that in the K to 12. I don't understand now that we have, again, more Chicano teachers, administrators, people in school boards, why that knowledge level isn't seeping down. And a required ethnic studies class isn't going to cut it. That's not enough. All of that knowledge has to be distributed when a teacher is teaching about American literature, about American history, about American culture, about American civics, anything in the humanities and social sciences. That new knowledge is being produced out of Chicano studies, Latino studies, has to be integrated. So all these kids understand the fullness of what society represents, which is a constellation of many, many people who have contributed to that society. But if you're only still teaching the contributions of one largely white groups of people, then, and yet the majority of your students are students of color, that's a relationship that isn't going to work, and it's not working. So yes, we've produced a lot of that knowledge, and that knowledge now has to be seeped down in the K to 12. And I think that is a challenge that I would make to all of our teachers, principals, administrators, members on school board. What are you doing to integrate this new knowledge about Chicanos and Latinos into your classrooms when you're faced with most of your students being Chicanos and Latinos. It's a crime if that isn't done.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Josh, so much. I really appreciated that.
All right. Take care. Appreciate
The
it.
opportunity.